Our first presenter is Lauren WIllette, and she's a Ph.D. candidate in the Heritage Studies program. Her research area includes Arkansas and the Ozarks, with a focus on women, African Americans, popular culture, and folklore. Lauren is the Folk Arts Survey Coordinator at the Arkansas Folks and Traditional Arts Program, which is a statewide program of the University of Arkansas Libraries. She has previously worked as a writing instructor and has directed the Ozark Foothills Literacy Project in Batesville. Lauren's presentation is titled Women Farmers in Arkansas, and it is based on her own fieldwork as well as on the fieldwork findings of others related to contemporary women farmers. She is using materials from the Arkansas Folks and Traditional Arts Program, and she will be sharing a lot of the wisdom and practices she learned from women she interviewed in recent years, as recently as Monday, actually. Thank you, Lauren.
Good morning. Can you guys hear me? Yeah. Get closer. Is that what you said? Okay. So good morning. My name is Lauren, and I'm going to be presenting my paper, Women Farmers in Arkansas, Contemporary Struggles and Practices. I'm currently, as a student in the Heritage Studies program, I'm currently working on my dissertation on Billie Joe Tatum, who is a writer and naturalist from Arkansas in my hometown of Melbourne. And I work for the State Folk Arts Program, Arkansas Folk and Traditional Arts, which is housed in the archives and special collections at Mullins Library. I've been able to focus a lot of my research for my PhD on folklore and folk life and Arkansas and the Ozarks region, and sometimes my personal interests really align well with the goals of AFTA, and that's how this presentation has come together. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about Arkansas folk and traditional arts and kind of how we fit in the archive before I move on to the background of this project and talk about my example of the Heritage Herb Garden as one main portrayal of gardening and homesteading in Arkansas. And then I'm going to share my current research that I've gathered through interviews around the state. And then I'm going to end by sort of focusing on how all of these different examples of homesteading and gardening and farming make use of permaculture principles. The main women that I'm going to focus on will be Tina Marie Wilcox at the beginning with my example at the Ozark Folk Center, and then we'll also talk about Kathy Allgood, Meredith Martin Moats, and Sage Holland. There has been a history of a state folk arts program in Arkansas since the 1980s, and I'm sure most of you guys are aware of that since it was previously housed here at A-State. The work that state folk arts programs do varies. I'm able to work remotely from Jonesboro for AFTA in order to try to move our research to this side of the state as well and interact with people in the Delta and other parts of Arkansas outside of Fayetteville and the Ozarks. My long-term outreach focus includes continuing to work with the Community Scholars Program and the apprenticeship program at AFTA. And I'm documenting career paths of our contemporary master tradition bearers who work with apprentices for our program, and then also working to build the knowledge of the history of public folklore in Arkansas while doing other outreach and programming. So my fieldwork is sort of all over the place, but when I can, I bring it back to gardening and farming. I do want to point out the mission statement of AFTA. I can't read it, where it's specifically the part that says that we're dedicated to building cross-cultural understanding by documenting, presenting, and sustaining living traditional arts and cultural heritage. For my own purposes, with my position as a public folklorist, I tend to think of folklore as the art of living. And so I lean often on Zora Neale Hurston's famous definition of the term from her article, Folklore and Music, where she says, folklore is the boiled down juice of human living. It does not belong to any special time, place, nor people. And she continued by saying, folklore is still in the making. So this art of living is embodied lots of times in heirlooms and recipes and stories that are passed down, but sometimes we also find it, you know, in the spoon that makes the fried potatoes taste better or taste right, or the direction that the horseshoe ought to hang and why people feel so passionately about it. So all of these ideas and details in this quote is just, I'm just sort of sharing my call to action to myself to continue to document folk life across the state when and where I can. And I also want to share how AFTA frames folk arts and traditions. We think of these as rooted in communities and learned in communities, so they start from the ground up. They're often grassroots. That they're new and emerging, because we know that as communities evolve and change, they also create new traditions. And we also think of them as diverse yet universal. So as you can see, our mission has 3 prongs to document, present, and sustain folk life. So part of this mission means that I can document women farmers and homesteaders across the state, and so that's great. And it made room for my project, which began in 2020. My first involvement with AFTA was for an internship where I interviewed different people across the state, both men and women, about how they were using gardening to respond to the pandemic. And then I grew that project into looking at food activism in the state as well, because I just became really interested in the way that people were sharing meals and foods and things like that, and wanted to make sure that got documented. But I'm going to focus on gardening today. So as I completed that, and you can see I've listed the different people that I spoke to that summer in 2020 and broken them up between food activism and gardeners here on this slide. Some people were doing both, like Rachel Reynolds, Dorothy Kiumbi, and Nikki Evans-Singston. I'm bad with her name. So this project, as I said, dealt with the ways that people were responding to the pandemic. And then out of that project, my position at AFTA grew into working with Mid-America Arts Alliance to survey folk artists across the state. And then with the help of Arkansas Arts Council, I've been able to stay on part-time and continue doing the different work that I've described. And it's also, this project also allows me to combine my work that I did as a graduate assistant in heritage studies, where I created a series called the Ozark Folk Center Collection out of the larger and unprocessed Johnny Miller collection here at A-State. So that was helpful in this research and my understanding of my example of the Folk Center. So folklore is an academic practice that often seems to be on the edges of academia, which is a discipline folklore, a discipline that is reduced rather than complicated at times at least. And Dorothy Noyes speaks to the necessary complexity of folkloristic practice in her essay, Humble Theory, which is from 2008. And in that essay, she explains that there are 3 connected elements of folkloristic practice. She says the field cannot theorize without strongly grounded in-depth ethnography of particulars. The field has no purpose without engagement in the world. Practice in the world has no lasting efficacy without theory to clarify its means. and ends and makes its efforts cumulative. The ethnographer, the practitioner, and the theorist are mutually dependent and mutually constitutive. They cohabit to different degrees in singular folklorist bodies. And then she goes on and says that when any of these three labors is neglected, the archive, the public practice, or the academic program, that the discipline of folklore suffers. So for me, this speaks to all of my work because I'm actively doing field work, but I use archival thinking and methods in my collecting and in my research and in the training that we do at AFTA. And I'm also always planning programming for events like this, but also for other people to learn more about folk arts. So this is one way, this is one way that I see myself as a folklorist participating in archival work and working in an archive. My work at AFTA and as a heritage scholar does put me in all three spheres, as I said, and these practices are a part of heritage scholarship. My own definition of heritage pulls from Celeste Ray's definition in Southern Heritage on Display, Public Ritual and Ethnic Diversity within Southern Regionalism, a book that she edited and provides an introduction in. My definition is heritage is the evolving creative process of selecting and interpreting memory and history through often idealized representations, performances, and activism in an effort to negotiate identity on an individual and collective level. So heritage is the process that we use to connect the past with the present. Sometimes this is done purposefully, and other times heritage production happens without prior planning or knowledge of that process. For me, my work as a public folklorist and heritage scholar allowed me to interact with this process and with the people involved with the process at a grassroots level. I see myself and other heritage scholars as bridge figures able to take part in and observe community heritage and folk life events, and then use those experiences and collected information to create starting points and build collections for future and current research. So I'm taking all of these different views and applying them to women farmers, the subject that I'm actually here to discuss, which brings me to one of Arkansas's heritage tourism sites, the Ozark Folk Center. So from a history or heritage point of view, the state park is an important part of the way that homesteading and gardening and farming are portrayed on a national and international scale in Arkansas. And visitors at the park are met with a mix of the modern and traditional when they walk in and when they see the gardens and pretty much anything there. So I'm kind of interested in how do Arkansans who are farming and homesteading today, how does that meet and mix with the view that we get of this practice and tradition at the Folk Center? So the Heritage Herb Garden, their portrayal of homesteading includes this plaque to Billie Jo Tatum, who was the head gardener at the Folk Center when it started, and then she trained Tina Marie Wilcox, who I interviewed in 2019, and she's been there since 1984 curating the gardens. Those uninterested in homesteading or gardening, for those people, this portrayal might be one of the only ones that is readily available. And so that's part of the reason that I'm using it. The original plants in the herb garden were gathered by Billie Jo and her nephew Jimmy Lee from the forest around Wildflower, which is Billie Jo's home in Melbourne, and then they brought them there for transplanting in fruit jars and coffee cans, so it looked more like something from some old-timer's house out in the country, according to Tina. Tina trained under Billie Jo and with an herbalist named Stephen Foster and with a man who designed and expanded the garden at the Folk Center named Jim Long. Most of her learning was done out of doors where they foraged different plants and things like that to bring from the Ozarks into the gardens at the state park. And Tina makes sure that everybody understands that just about every plant, from the trees and the woods all the way down to the weeds that you see and into their formal gardens, that everything is useful. Some of the women that I interviewed did also move here, like Tina did, from other areas. And Billy Joe was from Arkansas, so one of the women that I interviewed is a longtime Arkansas resident and grew up in the state. All of the women, including Tina and the ones that I interviewed, they also try to gather their knowledge from many different resources and experience over time, and most of them don't have any formal training in gardening or homesteading. And they all try to use all the different parts of what they grow, which happens on their farms and at the Folk Center. The Heritage Herb Garden may not meet one's expectations of what a garden would have looked like in the early 1900s, which is sort of what we expect from there. But there are a lot of different plants from all over the world. So these different plants and examples that people gathered and donated from different places in Arkansas, and the foraging techniques, that's all echoed within the contemporary practices of farmers now. Tina discusses the way that the herb garden has changed and grown with something she calls evolving culture. And she says, somebody wise said that the only sure thing is change, and death and taxes, I guess, goes with that too, but change is going to happen. And so that's something that all of the farmers that I interviewed also echoed, was that change is something that they expect, and that they are happy to continue doing experiments within their farms and gardens to prepare for that change and learn how to deal with it. The first person that I interviewed in 2020 and in 2022 is Kathy Allgood. She runs Dripping Springs Farm in White County. You can see some information about how to find her on Facebook if you look up Dripping Springs Farm. She's a flower farmer, but she also produces all of the crops as far as produce is concerned to feed her family and her two adult children and their families on their garden. I also spoke with Meredith Martin Moats, who lives in Yell County in Dardanelle. She maintains two jobs, but also runs their Sulphur Springs truck patch with their husband. She flower farms, grows vegetables and produce for her own family, and creates teas and medicinal teas and hot teas for sell at farmers markets. And then they also farm mealworms. And then I also spoke with Sage Holland. Sage does not sell the produce that they create, but they do live fully off-grid in Fox. And so I fit them in because their practices are also traditional, but not for money. So next I want to look at some of the commonalities and differences that I want you guys to think about as I start telling the stories of these women. They all use different forms of permaculture. They try to reduce their waste by using things intentionally and fully whenever possible. So they're trying to create cycles of use on their farm. They view farming and homesteading as elements of experimentation and learning. They enjoy the challenge. They're all self-reliant, and that was a goal that made them enter into this lifestyle. And they all want to continue to move away from getting food from stores, and they all feel a love of the land and want to be in nature. Their differences are, Kathy's more conservative and does not really talk about permaculture principles in her gardening, however she does use them. Meredith really openly is considering climate change and climate farming, and so that makes her story stand out a little differently. And then Sage and her husband are working toward being as fully off-grid as possible, and they get a lot of their goods within the community of Fox. So those are kind of the ways that their stories are different. Sage also supplements her income with folk art, which is really the reason that I ended up there. So to bring this home and connect it back with folklore, I want to use another quote from Zora Neale Hurston, where she's continuing to describe folklore, and she talks about how it's both unique and universal within this quote, which is, you know, I chose it because of her voice. She says, "In folklore, as in everything else that people create, the world is a great big old serving platter, and all the local places are like eaten plates. Whatever is on the plate must come out of the platter, but each plate has a flavor of its own because the people take the universal stuff and season it to suit themselves on the plate. And this local flavor is what is known as originality." So I want to show you some of the universal and some of the original with regards to farming. First, we talk about Kathy. Kathy Allgood, here she is with her 2 Great Danes and a whole bunch of flowers. She lives in Judsonia. She's been farming for over 35 years. For over 25 years and lived in Arkansas for 35 years with her husband. She grew up moving around with a military family. She was farming well before the pandemic and had been farming for money for 5 years before the pandemic started. She has a few acres of flower gardens and then a few acres of produce, which includes fruit trees and pecan trees. She also has a section of her farm set aside for growing mushrooms and grows shiitake mushrooms among other ones. She's all the time putting up her produce and preparing for the next season. Her cycle that she's created is really a cycle of work that allows her freedom from a 9-to-5 job, but not freedom from work by any means. She does sometimes sell the excess mushrooms, but mostly they put them away and use them themselves. Most of what Kathy sells is just flowers, and she's a wholesale florist farmer, so she has a cut flower garden. Kathy puts most of her struggles and triumphs on social media, particularly Facebook. Okay, good. And she says of this practice, it's not all glamour, and that is true, and she takes her hardships in stride. She wishes that more farmers would share their struggles on Facebook, and she feels like people would learn more if more would share. Of her hardships, Kathy says that losing something you paid money for is the one that she doesn't enjoy the most, and she also notes that this could be your own fault or it might not be. You just have to have a lot of information and experiment. She says if you don't do it right, the flowers are shot. She also tells me that even when you, even when you go to other more experienced farmers for advice or try to look up the answer, often things don't turn out quite how you expect. She says everybody's weather is different and you just have to trial and error it for yourself. So I want to play a quick clip of Kathy talking about how they do work on their farm and how much time it takes.
Well, we are ready to start. And we're so used to the way life out there that we just get up and do it. But this is we are ready.
She gets quiet. So she says we're out here every day and we're used to it, but that it's a tough life. Next, I talked with Meredith Martin Moats. Meredith grew up in Dardanelle before moving away from her hometown to attend college, and she lived in a couple of other states before returning home. Meredith is also a folklorist, and she writes quite a bit on a blog about her farming experiences. So I call her return to home her Wendellberry moment, but she's too humble to make that comparison for herself. She had gardened before returning to Dardanelle in 2019, but in 2020 she was just putting in her second bed. So she and her husband homestead, and they're really working hard. They've been doing it for about 5 years, and they're working very hard to make their farm their main source of income. And she is really good with using cyclical methods in order to make her waste production be lower. Meredith does tell me that she uses permaculture principles in her homesteading, but she draws from multiple philosophies and doesn't use any one particularly rigidly. She also uses the concept of hugelkultur, which uses decaying wood, leaves, grass, and other compost materials found in nature to create a raised garden bed that you have to water less often. It kind of creates a sponge underneath the soil. They did have to put some dirt on their hugelkultur bed that they have, but that was 3 years ago, and they don't see the need to add any more dirt to that soil anytime soon. Instead, they use litter from the chickens and rabbits that they have. They also have a miniature pony and a donkey, so they use the manure there, and they also are composting constantly. Meredith is more able to continue to support the soil cycle since they started growing mealworms. And part of the reason that they did this was to be prepared for the continuing climate crisis. Meredith sort of jokes about this when we talked, and I'll play you this clip. It's only 7 seconds.
There was like kind of some layer of like, you know, like how do we survive the apocalypse? Oh, okay, let's grow up.
So she says there's a layer in their thinking of how do we survive the apocalypse? Oh, okay, we grow bugs. And that wasn't really what she was expecting to do, but it's what they're doing to make their farm work for them. Right now they sell to wildlife rescue operations, reptile owners, and similar ventures. But in other countries in the world, the insect protein market is really growing quite quickly, and they expect that it'll happen in the U.S. soon as climate change continues. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to play that again. Meredith is always considering climate change and how that affects her homestead and her goals for sustainability and community activism. And she's, like I said, she writes down a lot of her observations. In the last couple of years, Meredith has done what she calls climate farming, and she's sort of asking the question, how do we farm and how do we continue to do this when the books that were written for our regions and for farming no longer work because the weather patterns have changed? So she's noticed one weather pattern that I want to share. She says, throughout the year in Arkansas that it's chilly all the way until about April. Then we have a nice spring for a couple of weeks, and after that we go straight into hot weather. She then pointed out to me that August has cooled off a little and allowed for her garden to bounce back in August before more intense heat returns in September and October. So August is still hot, but growing food in 90-degree weather is much different than growing it in 105-degree weather, is what she told me. So her observance of this pattern means that she's planning to plant crops again this year, and they did well last year, in times when books would not recommend planting. And she's planting spring crops in August, like peas and lettuce that can grow into the fall, when in the past that probably wouldn't have been recommended. And she harvests and produces flowers all the way up until Thanksgiving. This year she's planning to just use crop cover into November and December to continue producing at least food at those times. So Meredith also shared in 2020, I interviewed her in 2020 and 2022, that she started gardening about a decade before 2020 when her mother had been diagnosed with terminal cancer, and she'd returned to Arkansas to care for her mom. And her garden and her relationship with the land is what allowed her to get through her grief. It did it.
What do you know that the books that were written for your region really don't work so much anymore, right?
Okay, next we have Sage. Sage Holland grew up in Southern California and then lived in the Pacific Northwest for many years. She's a glass bead maker, and she started that folk art while she was living in Seattle. Then she came to Arkansas in 1993 to live off-grid with her husband, Tom. They lived for many years at Meadow Creek, where she was the main gardener. Meadow Creek is a nonprofit land conservatory in Fox, where they explore how to live in a remote area while sustaining the area's natural resources. So once they had worked for many years at Meadow Creek, and like I say, Sage had served as the main gardener there for their community gardening, then they moved to their plot of land in 2008. This is Sage's garden and a flower that she grew with one of the glass beads that she made. The garden is pretty wild. They cleared this land also in 2008, and then they have used the wood that they cleared off of this space to build a barn. When they moved to this piece of land in 2008, they lived in what they called the shack. It was a small, uninsulated building. They had to haul water into it. They had a wood-burning stove, and they still make use of it now. It's on their front porch in their current house. Sage walked back and forth to check the tomato sauce she was making on that very stove to can later while we talked just on Monday. Their house that they live in is dug into the side of a hill. They don't have air conditioning. They use solar panels for their electricity, so they're completely off-grid. They do have a well now. Aside from Wi-Fi and phone bills, they are mostly living off the land and within the community of Fox. They don't really trade the vegetables that they're growing or the food, but they do trade their art, sometimes for different types of produce and things. They buy millet and quinoa and other items in bulk to supplement their diets. They grind their own wheat. They don't have any animals because they live so deep in the forest. So, like I say, they are able to sort of trade back and forth and then purchase what else they need.
You know, I was raised in Southern California.
Here's Sage.
But my mother had a garden, and I would eat the parts of whatever was edible that she grew, and the tangerines in the back, and so there was this, and the mint, making mint tea, those little things that you remember as a child. Second on the honeysuckle on the wall was in the backyard, and that led to me having this sense of connection with the earth and possibly getting away from being dependent on what the city or stores and all that. And someday, I guess I just go even early in life.
So this year, one of their struggles within the drought, they didn't have struggle to water their garden because of their well water, but they had more pests. One of the pests was Japanese beetles. So they set a trap for the Japanese beetles, and then that trap attracted raccoons. The raccoons, then they had to catch and then drive many miles away because they try to, reduce their harm on the environment as much as possible and would not kill an animal. So they have to drive them pretty far away to get rid of them. And then you can see a picture of them building the barn with the wood that they had cleared here a little bit better. Sage is someone who's just sort of bursting with knowledge about many different subjects, and she explained the details of how and why they chose this lifestyle with care. And she also, as shown through the clip I played, expressed that she had wanted to live this lifestyle for a very long time. At the end of our interview, she took me to the nearby Meadow Creek, the actual creek itself, to show me a natural sculpture that they had recently made. And we stopped at a bridge, and she said that they were glad to have the bridge because it meant that they didn't have to use logs to drive over, like place logs on the creek to drive over them to get to their home when they had supplies. And so they were happy that it was there, but it also allowed for more visitors and more four-wheelers and for more people to come in who don't care for the land in the way that she'd like to see it cared for. So that brings me to permaculture principles. How much time do I have left? oh my gosh, okay. So I'm going to go over permaculture principles rather quickly. But this is a design that means, the word comes from permanent agriculture or permanent culture. And it's a system that pulls from a lot of different knowledge, including indigenous knowledge. They're careful to say that they didn't invent anything new with this philosophy. And it can be applied to small-scale farming and farming in general, but also to life. The first principle is to observe and interact, so that you want to engage with nature and take it slow. All three women practice this by observing their crops and figuring out how they need to experiment and then acting accordingly. You also want to catch and store energy, so that you're planning ahead and making sure that you work in times of high energy so that you are prepared to meet your needs in times when they're going to need to be met. So you prepare to have needs that are going to be difficult. Obtain a yield. So you're making sure that your immediate needs are met before working toward more lofty goals. And you also want to be sure to get truly useful rewards. So they're all doing this in a certain way. They apply self-regulation and accept feedback. They all have to be very self-disciplined to live these lifestyles. And they're all considering their future in their thinking and wanting to make sure that they leave the world as good as they can and better than they found it, if possible. Use and value renewable resources and services. All of these women are creating cycles of use on their farms. That's really interesting. Meredith is really, really great at creating cycles, since mealworms produce frass, and she can add, which is waste, and you can add that frass to fertilizer. So she's able to really build up the red clay soil in Dardanelle by using these permaculture principles and creating a cycle. Produce no waste is another thing, so you want to make sure that you're using all of what you produce. Design from patterns to details is one. You want to make sure that you're not that you're stepping back to find a way to view a situation from other perspectives. You want to integrate rather than segregate. By putting things in the right place, relationships develop between them and they support each other. This principle is really important within agriculture with methods like Three Sisters, where you want to grow corn and beans together, and things like that. So you're bringing in plant diversity. Use small and slow solutions, so take it slow and be sure that you're on the right path. Use and value diversity. Again, this applies to plants, but also to people and their experiences. Use edges and value the marginal. The interface between things is where the most interesting events take place. By applying these principles so directly to their lives, I would argue that they are becoming the edges and the marginal in many ways, and that they're blazing their own paths on the edge. So they're creating the interesting stories while also using this value. And then creatively use and respond to change. So we can have a positive impact no matter what, but it's more positive if we're ready for the inevitable change. And all of the women that I talked to mentioned how change is constant and that it's not always linear. And really the only way to prepare for it is to know that it will happen. So both Meredith and Sage directly referred to permaculture in my interviews with them, and Kathy does put many of these principles to use, though she doesn't refer to this particular system or philosophy. Kathy does not tread as lightly when it comes to interfering with the environment, but she does, and she doesn't work quite as intentionally at creating cycles of use or reuse like Meredith and Sage, but those things are happening at her farm. She's very, very mindful of her consumption and her waste. Both Sage and Meredith noted that they don't follow permaculture extremely closely or by the book necessarily, as some people might, but they both feel that it's very important. Sage is probably applying the principles most directly and most carefully by the book, as you might say. In many ways, the homestead portrayed at the Heritage Herb Garden still holds true. You can see a lot of the carryover from that static image in the ways that people are still doing things now. Although, as I noted, the Heritage Herb Garden at the Folk Center has modernized, and so have many of the ideas and practices in farming. The diligence and creativity of early homesteaders has evolved, but the current problems with regard to climate change are no less dire than the ones faced by the early Arkansans that the Ozark Folk Center portrays. Using the principles of permaculture as a means to tend the land and become more self-reliant is a response to climate change that I hope continues to grow in popularity. These women are important parts of our region's cultural heritage and folk life, and they are each actively involved in the heritage process through their daily lives and work, and I'm honored to be able to document and present parts of their lives. Thank you.
Any more questions?
What about mealworms?
Okay, mealworms are, there's a market especially growing rapidly in France and Africa. According to Meredith Martin Moats, I have not had time to actually go and research what they're doing in those countries. Oh, sorry. But as climate change evolves and protein becomes more costly, people are turning to different forms of protein, including insects like mealworms and crickets. And so that's not a particularly active market for human consumption in the U.S., but we are moving towards using those forms of proteins in dog food. And then she sells to wildlife refuges and zoos and things like that. They started with both crickets and mealworms, but found keeping up with two was just too much, so then they went to the simpler form of mealworms, but do plan to add crickets later. So she's really battling climate change and planning for the future and how to make her farm work for her family very, very actively, and she's very upfront about that, which I really appreciate because the nature of farming is changing quite a lot because of climate change. I don't know about if they're still doing grown mushrooms in Shirley. Sage, who lives in Fox, which is the closest, they forage. The ones that live off the land, the closest, they do forage for mushrooms there, but and grow a few. But I don't know about if there's still a big market. I know Kathy sells her excess mushrooms within like 30 minutes when she puts them on her Facebook page. That's just a fern, just out in the Ozarks. That's a picture I took. It's just a fern, a fern seedling.
Fiddlehead fern.
Yes.
People pick those. Okay, I have heard of that, but I thought that was a thistle or something. One of our daughters lives in Aurora, Missouri, Southeast
Good for her. I hope she has Billy Joe Tatum's Wild Foods cookbook. Yeah, I just said I hope she has Billy Joe Tatum's Wild Foods cookbook.